Hello everybody and welcome back to the John Schofield Trust podcast, a space for early career, aspiring and working journalists to get advice and insights into the industry. I'm your host, Bethany Lee, an early career journalist and 2024 fellow of the Trust. And we're talking today about News with Foreign Accent, which is a project launched by Barbara Serra. Barbara is a multilingual Italian-born journalist and TV news presenter currently working at Sky News. She has over 20 years of experience, and she was the first non-native English speaker to present a prime-time TV news programme on British TV. She's also awarded a knighthood by the Italian government for her work in journalism. And I'm talking about her as if she's not here, but she is.
But I am.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Welcome to the studio and thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to talk about your career a little bit later because you, like I mentioned there, have so much experience. But first, I really want to dive into the topic of News with Foreign Accent. And I want to start with your early career because you mentioned in the past that there were some early experiences where you were kind of criticised or held back because of your accent. Was that something that you anticipated going into the journalism industry, or what were those early experiences?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for asking me to be part of this podcast. It's a project that I really care about, and it's something that I do a lot of work with younger journalists on. So it really is a pleasure to be here. You said 20 years. I'm doing the sums. I think it's like 25 years actually that I've been in journalism, and I am Italian-born, but I grew up sort of here, there, and everywhere around Europe. Learned English as a second language when I was about 10, 11, I would say, and then came here for uni. This is back in 1993, and became a journalist around the year 2000. Now, obviously, I like to think my English is fluent, but I think you can tell that I'm not. I think most people can tell I'm actually second language English, but you can definitely tell I'm not born in the United Kingdom. Now, I started working in journalism around 2000. I started going on air around 2002, 2003, and that became an issue. Now, this is obviously, baby steps at the beginning. It's like the weekend reporting shift on local TV or local radio, but it was always an issue. And I think now that I've done a lot of work around accents, there is obviously a lot of highlighting of the issue of accent bias, which is also part of it. But I suppose the thing that I highlight is people who speak English as a second language, which invariably tends to be because, they're born outside of the UK. And so it ties in with identity, it ties in with nationality, if you will, it ties in with diversity. And there's different levels. It's one issue on national news in the UK. It's another on international channels. But I always felt it was something that was ignored and in that way not addressed. And I have a big thing that, when we talk about diversity in news, you have to represent the people. We always speak of the voice of the voiceless. Well, often that means people with different backgrounds and different accents. So it's a complicated issue. There's different ways of addressing it in national news, regional news or international news. But I just always felt it was something that wasn't really addressed properly. Now a little bit more, but still not very much, judging by the kind of feedback that I get. And, you very kindly said that was the first non-native English speaker, basically foreign sounding person who read the news when I presented Channel 5 News back in 2005. I did that for about 6 months. I did the main evening program. Kirsty Young would do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I would do Thursday till Sunday. It's fair to say it was an experiment that didn't work because I was, my contract was not renewed as such. And I was at Sky News even back then as a reporter. It was just about okay. And it was obvious that they were kind of pushing me towards doing more international news. Domestically, it was an issue. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that is. I think news is about trust. And trust is tribal. So there's one thing to talk about accent bias, but I do think there are issues there that need to be addressed. And I think if you don't address it and if you're not honest with yourself as a young journalist, then it's always going to hold you back and you're not even really going to know why or what you can and should do about it. So basically, because I started having a lot of conversations with young journalists because I was one of the very few people that they would see and crucially hear on air, I sort of decided to launch the project when I realized that, there was a kind of demand for it that no one else, to be honest, no one else had the experience to try to address.
Yeah, and within that project you do sort of coaching for younger journalists.
So it started, I mean, after I did, I worked in domestic news. I sort of started at the BBC as the lowest of the low broadcast assistant on the Today program, making tea and booking taxis, but, progressed quite quickly into what was then GLR and then London Live, which is BBC London. First radio, then TV, then went to Sky as a reporter. And at the time, Sky News had the contract for Channel 5 News. So I did the first 5-6 years of my career in domestic news, but it was always coming up. And interestingly, the accent thing is a lot easier to deal with because it's not just an accent, it's a foreignness thing. It's quite, there's a lot of layers. Much easier later on in my career than at the beginning. And that's when Al Jazeera launched back in 2006. So I went there as a presenter. They quite liked, everyone to be really international. And then I left in 2016. I left in 2022. And when I did, I thought I was going to leave TV news forever. I'm like, this is the end of TV news. I don't want to be a newsreader anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And so I launched a Substack. So actually, the title of my newsletter is News with a Foreign Accent. I have also launched an online course. But what I feel strongly about in the newsletter is that having a foreign accent, you don't have it just because. There's a reason why all of us speak the way we do. It could be a regional accent, often in the UK. And I say this as someone who's, an adopted Brit, but foreign enough to say that you're all obsessed with the way everyone's accent sound. And you can trace back people's schools or exact, geographic origin, which is fine. And so, it's something that I felt strongly about because I think the way that you speak probably says the most about you than any other feature. I think even more than your ethnicity, religion, often nationality, because it's all in the way you speak. And so my newsletter, The News with a Foreign Accent, is about how having a different point of view makes you look at the news in a different way. So I do a lot around, diversity, but a lot around the rise of the far right or, fascism in general, because it's one of my sort of specialist topics. Again, because I have an Italian background and that's kind of like a historical background as well. But I called it that for a reason. Different voices tell different stories or at least have different points of view. But what I also launched is a program, again, because I was getting, and it's wonderful. I love it when, young journalists get in touch. It is always, honestly, it is an honor. I know it can sound a bit flowery, but it really is an honor when anyone gets in touch and says, maybe you might be able to help. And because I never had a mentor in this when I was going through some of the challenges, I always try to make time, but news is busy and sometimes I don't have time. So I created this online course and there's lots of layers, but there's like a really basic online, 6 online lessons, 10 minutes each where I go through the main points.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because it's kind of this balance between staying authentic to your identity and also seeing that, as you said, like a strength. It informs the way you tell stories, where you're from and all those things, but also kind of fitting into the rigid mold of British broadcasting at the same time.
I'm going to push back. I don't think that British broadcasting is that rigid
okay,
at all.
Good.
Certainly not. And I mean, I'm kind of proof of it because that was allowed on air even 20 years ago. I just think, so it's interesting because people would ask me questions, right? And so the question they ask is, how can I become a newsreader? And my reply is always, you need to become a journalist. You're not becoming a newsreader. But then often a lot of people will say, how can I change my accent? And look, I've got ultimately it's a personal thing. My argument would be, if you are truly second language English, as in there's a window, right? I mean, if you learned English in a multilingual household and you sort of absorbed it when you were very young. Like my son is bilingual because his dad's English and I'm Italian, so we speak to him in both languages, but I would never say he's second language English because he absorbed it as a little kid. There's kind of like a window, and that window tends to close at around 13, 14, where your accent is set, right? And so that window, so I'd learned English, but I didn't learn it in the UK. So sometimes people can almost think I'm a native English speaker, but not British. They can't quite pinpoint it, right? So I would say to anyone, if you are learning outside of that window, chances are you can't fully change the way you sound. I know that some actors do it. Like you always have like those Americans that have a British accent and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
But you're learning lines. Journalism is not learning lines. You're reporting in the field. You're writing things really quickly. You're presenting live on air. The whole point of it is that you have to react live, and also that you should sort of be yourself.
Yeah.
And so what I always say is you have to be authentic. Like, there's no point me pretending that I was born and raised in Oxford, right? You have to be authentic, but what you cannot evade is clarity. You have to be crystal clear.
Yeah.
Your accent cannot be an excuse for lack of clarity. And so I actually have done, and Sky did it 20 years ago, because bless them, they were trying to develop me, right? And they realized there was an issue and they were helping me. So I've done a lot of speech training for the clarity. It's the diction, it's the speed, it's the intonation. You know, even between Americans or Australians and Brits, intonation was sometimes, you know, like Australians have a very different kind of way of phrasing things. But I would always say to someone, first of all, I'm not a voice coach as such. So if you want to change your accent, that's just different. But I would say there are things that you can do to help with clarity. But I would always advise against trying to sound something that you're not. I just think, first of all, it's all about authenticity right now in general. And I just think, who do you think you're fooling and why? And I think that once you get through the clarity stumbling block, actually it is a strength. At this point in my career, all the things that were complicated and were awkward and were just odd and stumbling blocks, actually it took 20 years, arguably 25, but I think they've become strengths, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the way to handle it. And to also maybe be a little realistic. Like, I have to say, being back at Sky and presenting, I do some international stuff, but most of what I do is domestic news, and I do like the press preview or, you know, just the main evening programs, which will be, you know, domestic or international, but for a domestic audience. I'm very proud of that because I think, you know, and I do feel, because I've lived in the UK for ever so long, I do feel like it's a sense, I almost feel like an acceptance. And I'm always very aware, though, that, you know, I don't know how to say it. I try to be honest with the audience, right? But I have also lived here since I was 19. But I know that there's some jobs, you know, one thing is Sky, which is it's a domestic channel, but has an international footprint as well. And there's quite a few of us, right? I know that there's some jobs I'd never get. I'd never be the main presenter on, I don't know, ITV News at 6. I'm just not the right fit. And I just think in this job, you know, presenting any job, any career in media, my advice would always be open to so many things, but do try to play to your strengths, because otherwise you can make life very difficult for yourself.
Yeah, like finding the right role for you and finding your place within the system and all those kind of things.
You know, without it, I mean, I remember when I trained in at City, and I don't know whether, I think she was honest, but I remember my trainer at City University, this is back in 1999, so it is a while ago, she sat me down and she just said, you know, you'll never be on air for the BBC, you'll never be on air on domestic news. And then, interestingly, my first job was actually on air for the BBC, but it was BBC London, or it was Euronews, this thing that I used to do for 5 Live, which, you know, always had a bit of a foreign thing. And I think if I'd stayed in domestic news without having gone to Al Jazeera, I think I probably would have ended up as like a foreign correspondent or, you know, done more stuff like that. But I remember at the time, you know, a little bit of that, I'll show you. But actually she was right, you know, because what she was trying to do was a version of what I'm doing now to young journalists. Be honest, work at it. The world is changing, you know, there are so many different voices, and even within the UK, you know, I mean, when I came to the UK, net migration was 0 back in 1993. You know, things have changed. British culture has changed. But I do, you know, 25 years down the line, actually appreciate the honesty of that City University lecturer, because actually she prepared me, and it's good to be prepared.
Yeah, I think that's a very mature way to look at that experience.
You've got to, well, you know, it's the experience also of the audience. It's not, you know, people aren't being gatekeepers. People watching at home, and again, TV news is something so particular because you're you, but you're also not, right? When I'm presenting on Sky, I am a Sky News presenter. Now, I am me, I'm Barbara Serra. I'm obviously, you know, of a slightly different background than the audience knows, but I am there trying to do justice to the work of all the correspondents and all, the other presenters and everyone and the producers and everyone that goes into making the Sky News product, right? And so it's a realism. You cannot be an obstacle. You cannot get in the way of that hard work, being emphasized. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the way I look at it. Yeah, again, I never felt hard done by. I was upset when I was younger.
Yeah,
I
of
was
course.
a bit softer when I was younger. I need to get a little bit tougher. But yeah, I think it's just kind of accepting the whole, the world as it is.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice as well for our early career journalists who are listening. I want to talk as well, because you've written on your blog and your Substack before about this idea, the very idea of international news. And you've said that there's no such thing as international news. It's English language news.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that idea for us?
Yeah. So, and it sounds harsher than it actually, I mean, it's just a fact. Look, English is the world's global language. It just is. Don't tell the French, but it really is. When Al Jazeera launched an international channel back in 2006, there was no question it was going to be in any other language than English. And in journalism, certainly in broadcasting, but I would argue in written journalism as well, language is our tool. It's not enough to just speak good English. Like there's TV reports and there's TV reports. Some of the most memorable TV reports, especially in TV where, you're really picking your words because you don't have the space that you would have in a newspaper article or a podcast. The best TV reports sometimes are like poetry, marrying it with picture. Most native English speakers wouldn't be able to do that. And so to do it as a second language, and I feel like I'm patting myself on the back going, look at me, I'm so great. But, to all people who do it as a second language, it's really difficult. And so when I say there's no such thing as international news, and I always do this, especially when I'm outside in a non-Anglophone environment, I'll say, well, who do you think when you think international news? And people will say, well, we think the BBC, we think CNN, we think the New York Times, we think the Guardian, we think the Economist, the FT, Bloomberg sort of, Reuters, AP. Well, what do all of them have in common? They're in the English language and they're British and American. Now, I actually think, having worked, my very, very, very first job was actually as a CNN intern. So that's my claim. And also having worked a little bit in the States. I've got huge respect for the culture of American and British journalism. And most of my career has been in British journalism. But everyone has a point of view, even when you try not to. And especially the channels that are divided, like CNN International or CNN Domestic, or the BBC World Service and then BBC Domestic. And interestingly, the BBC have merged their news channels now, which is, an interesting experiment. I'd love to hear from them how they think it's going. But the mothership will always be the domestic channel. Why? Because in the BBC's case, for example, that's where the license fee comes from. And in CNN's case, most of their advertising or, most of their effort goes there. And so you always have a core audience. And even, I do think a lot of the international output does try to, to have a diverse workforce. If you listen to the BBC World Service, you'll hear, rightly so, a lot of accents, a little bit on CNN International as well. But there are genuine obstacles to hiring people whose English may simply not be to the standard needed. Trust me, you do not want to be presenting live in a breaking news situation if your English isn't quite up to it. And again, I'm saying English language and not just accent, right? Because with the accents, you can have a very thick regional accent in the UK, and that could get in the way of clarity. If your second language English, we're talking about language, vocabulary, grammar. And again, it could be good enough until you are in that situation. And so even on those channels, actually, it's always going to be fewer people. And a lot of those channels will have the best will in the world. But if there's a linguistic obstacle, but I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that any of those channels have any training that looks to that, media training specifically for second language English speakers. And I think, look, the BBC is the BBC, CNN is CNN, they're American and they're British, and that's what they should be. Sky News is a British domestic channel or aimed at a domestic audience, even though we obviously have a big international audience and we do a lot of international coverage. But there's a glitch in the system because of English being the global language. I think AI is going to change a lot, and I think already I see it on my feed on Instagram how much is just automatically translated. I'm not the biggest fan of that because I do believe language is culture. Mm-hmm. So you can't just, do simultaneous translations. People will have points of view and, sort of kind of intellectually they will come from a certain, I don't call it prejudices, but, they will have their backgrounds, right? Yeah. But so when I say I've kind of like given a very lengthy, slightly complicated, I've written it in the newsletter if you want to go to news with a foreign accent. But yeah, that's what I mean when I say there's no such thing as truly international news. As long as you're aware of it, I think it's fine.
Hi. This is a quick pause from the episode just to say that the John Schofield Trust is a charity. And if you want to support the work that we do and help the next generation of journalists break through, then you can head to www.johnscofieldtrust.org.uk/donate. Thank you, and let's get back to the episode. So if you take that idea that you just said about language being culture, do you think that the fact that English is the sort of like blanket language across all of these domestic and international sort of channels, do you think that leads to a monocultural approach to how we tell the news, or do you think that's gotten much better?
I think it's changed a lot from when I started 25 years ago, and rightly so, and also because the audience is changing, also because as a platform, even TV channels aren't just TV channels anymore, Sky, but all of them, news providers, we're on all sorts of platforms, right? And that gives you more freedom because it's the linear TV channel that in a way is a bit of a straitjacket because you are still catering for a mainly domestic audience that is sitting there. They can't kind of choose what they're watching. They're watching whatever we're putting out live. Whereas if you're looking at podcasts or digital platforms or the app, you can kind of scroll through. And if you're not interested in something, you go on, onto something else. So I wouldn't call it monocultural. Mm-hmm. But I do think there is nothing wrong with the BBC having a sort of British outlook on the world, and then we can have a separate discussion on what British outlook means. But, Al Jazeera was blatantly, openly, we were trying to be the voice of the global South, or arguably the voice, or give a platform to the voices of the Arab world. It's absurd to say that there's one Arab voice, right? And I just think I see news as a puzzle right now. I go to different outlets for different stories. I have my go-to places. So if I only have 10 minutes in the morning and I'm rushing around and I don't know, I've something to do with my son and blah, 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 and I don't have time to consult a lot of outlets, then I have my go-to places, Sky being one and a few others. But otherwise, I will read widely. Substack, I think, is great. A lot of other publications that I trust. And I will know their points of view. You're reading Al Jazeera, you know their point of view, but read it, right? Yeah. Or other networks. So I think there is nothing wrong. I think every channel needs to have an identity. There's nothing wrong with that. You need it because you need to know your audience, right? But I do think, obviously, listen, I mean, when I think of how, there was reaction to me when I was at Sky back in 2003 or Channel 5, and when I think now, it's very, very different, So I think people are used to hearing different voices. I hopefully have also become a better broadcaster, I hope, and I've lived in the UK a lot longer. And can I just add, just for journalists, listening, young journalists, it's not just your voice or your accent. I think for a lot of the foreign-born journalists that come to the UK, and obviously they come to the UK because all the main networks are here. Unless you're going to go to the States, it's here, right? And they'll get in touch with me and they'll say, well, what can I do? And then we have the conversation about language, fine, right? But then I'll also say, look, it's not just about language. A lot of them will get in touch with me after they finish their postgraduate or their master's. And so many of them will have been in the UK 4 or 5 years, but most of that time in London, most of that time at uni. And I'll say, one of the problems is, if you're going to work in British broadcasting, is that you genuinely don't probably know that much about the UK. What do you know about the education system? I mean, I've learned so much about the education system now that my son is going through school, the 11 plus. Oh my God, I was never aware that was such a massive thing. Or, the health system, primary care, what that means, how local government works, or just generally what makes people tick. I think if you're a journalist, you need to understand, by and large, what makes your audience tick, what they react to, what they know and what they don't know. And so for a lot of the foreign-born journalists, I tell them, the truth is you just need to get to know the audience more. And it's taken me, again, one of the reasons I think that now I'm more comfortable presenting is just because actually I've lived in this country since 1993. That's 32 years. So I'll always be foreign-born. I'm British by passport, but obviously, I'm very aware I'm not British like I would have been if I'd either grown up here or was born here. But I have lived through the past 32 years with all the ups and downs and just getting to know the culture and kind of making it mine. And so I think that is another big stumbling block to young journalists. And I'll tell them this is another piece of advice I keep in the newsletter. I have like a sort of my 8 bits of advice there. No one is going to tell you. It's a very awkward conversation, for a news editor to have, because it goes at the heart of who you are as a person, even regional accents, right? Why do you speak that way? Well, you speak that way because you were born there, right? So it's linked to who you are. And very often it's an awkward conversation that, in my experience, not all, but many bosses will kind of avoid because they're scared of being offensive. But if you don't have the conversation, then as a young journalist, you find yourself 10 years into your career and it's not really going anywhere. And look, it's tough anyway. But if you don't address certain issues, then, I think it's better to just kind of like take the bull by the horns.
Face it head on.
Well, at least face it.
Yeah.
And then nothing worse than wasting time. And like in any career, you have to tread water sometimes. It's not always going to be an upward trajectory. But I think if you have an issue, then you should try and deal with it.
No, absolutely. And I think this topic is so sort of expansive and we could talk about it for hours. But I do want to talk about some other parts of your career as well, just because I think there is so much to talk about and that people will be able to get advice from. One of the main things that I want to bring up was the documentary that you made back in 2020. Yeah, 2020, Fascism in the Family, on the links between fascism in Italy and then your own family's history. I specifically wanted to ask what it was like to work on a professional project that was also really deeply personal. And what your advice would be to any journalists out there who maybe want to do the same but are like scared to.
Well, you're right to be scared. You're right to, well, I don't know about scared. You need to get used to, and this would be a wider piece of advice, some things are just uncomfortable. I think the personal makes it uncomfortable in a different way, but a lot of interviews have to be uncomfortable. You're not in this to be popular. You're not in this to make friends. So the project was a documentary that I made for Al Jazeera when I was still there, and that now is a book in Italian, and that I'm hoping soon will become a book in English. And the story is that I'm obviously of Italian heritage. Well, I'm Italian born, and my grandfather was a fascist in Mussolini's regime, which obviously, set in the UK is quite shocking, and I guess it should be, but in Italy it is unfortunately very, very common. I mean, I think if I was having a conversation with 3 people, at least another one would say so was mine, right? But mine was quite interesting because he was quite high up regionally, and so I kind of did some a lot of digging through archives, and not just because, the story of my grandfather, but obviously to try to learn the lessons for now. I am not one of these people who thinks that we're a step away from fascism, but I do think that there is a lot of instability. I think that the world is changing. I think the world that was created, the international world order created after World War II, so interestingly, after the fall of fascism and Nazism, that's changing, arguably ending, and so that there's lessons to learn. And this also ties in with the news with a foreign accent, because why do I have that story? Well, I have that story because I come from a different background, because I'm of Italian heritage. So what would my advice be? I would say if it is something quite like this, you don't necessarily have to make a documentary. Like you can just like dig and maybe think about writing an article and make your life a little bit easier. But I think in general, there's a danger in being too introverted, and I think that's also a change that I've seen in journalism. There's a lot more about, I think, and personal opinions and people using their lived experiences. And look, I've done my lived experience with the project News with a Foreign Accent, and I did it within reason with this on the fascism issue. I have to say, in both cases, I felt that it was justified. And the fascism film and now book and now possibly another book in English, it is one of the topics of our time, and not so much necessarily the rise of the far right, which in itself is a controversial statement, but the cracks that we're seeing in democracy and liberal democracy, right?
Yeah.
And I have to say, I learned so much from studying my grandfather's story properly. And in the documentary, I didn't speak to a single family member. It was all archive stuff. It was all historical things, some interviews, old books, because obviously on something like that, there's nothing online. You can't go on Google or ChatGPT. But it was incredibly helpful because, my grandfather lived through 2 wars. He fought in World War I. And, you have to understand what makes people act the way they do. And that has been at the core of my journalism, from working at Al Jazeera for 16 years to doing this job and just learning from it and then trying to see what the dynamics are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great documentary, so I'd recommend everybody go
Thank
and watch
you.
it and read it if it becomes an English book.
Yeah, hopefully I have to write it first, but yes.
When it does. So you mentioned a bit about interviewing in that, and we actually have a question from another mentee on the Trust who's going to ask you about interviewing specifically, so I'm going to play that now.
Hello, my name is Veronica. I'm a multimedia journalist currently based in Edinburgh, but I'm originally from Italy. I had some episodes in the past where some of my interviewees were immediately implying that I didn't know the topic enough since I was a foreigner, or specifically during Vox Pops, they were asking me where I came from before answering my questions. So I wanted to ask you, how do you cope with that? And how do you keep your confidence or your authority in situations like that?
Gosh, okay. I've had that a lot, but not even in interviews. What I get sometimes in London, people will stop me and ask for directions, and I'll tell them. And then I see that they'll take like 10 steps and ask someone else because they think I'm like a tourist. And I'm like, no, I know where I'm going. Well, half the time anyway. So listen, having a foreign accent says something. It says, I am not from here, right? It just does. There's no way around it. And people react to it. I think being asked, where are you from, is not offensive. Like I always call myself, I'm very honest, I am a migrant. I mean, I'm British because I became British in 2011, but I'm an adopted Brit. And I think you need to be honest, and people are allowed to have the reaction that they have. Like I said earlier, news is about trust. Trust is tribal. If someone's going to tell you their story, they sort of want to know that you have, how can I call it, the knowledge to put it in context, right? I can understand why it's upsetting, and I say this as someone who has often been upset by that. But you just prep. You're probably going to have to prep a little bit more than other people, but because you have more gaps to fill because of your foreign background. It's not just that because, whoever is asking you that question, where you're from, may have reason to ask you that. Like, I'll tell you, it's easier now, but one of my most terrifying things when I'm on air, and less so now, was the obit. The obituary, when someone dies, right?
Yeah.
And it always used to happen more so when I was on air 20 years ago. Well, like someone would die and everyone on the newsroom would be really upset. And like invariably it could be anybody, but like, I don't know, some children's entertainer that they'd all grown up with. And, they were near tears. And I'm sitting there going, I have no idea who this is. Now, that happens a lot less now, obviously, because I have been here for so long, right? So a lot of that reaction, I'm sorry to say, is valid. So what do? You prep more. No two ways around it. You just do. But when it comes to people trying to intimidate you, I'll say this, that will never stop, and they will just use whatever your weakness might be, right? This is a tricky time, I think, in politics and in journalism. I do think that journalists are, people are taking aim at journalists and our credibility and our authority. And especially in confrontational interviews, people try to do that whichever way. Within reason, you need to toughen up about that. You just do. Because right now, it's not an easy time, I think, in journalism in general. You can see that in Donald Trump's press conferences where he literally singles out journalists and like, who are you, where are you from, not where are you from is in accent. Although he's done it a couple of times, and I've put it on my Instagram page, always makes an issue like when someone has a foreign accent, it goes, oh, beautiful accent, I can't understand you. But beyond that issue, just in general for anyone, if someone wants to rob you of your authority, they'll pick on anything. And maybe if you have a foreign accent, that's the thing they'll pick on. So you got to go prepped, but also just kind of toughen up to it, and you just do your job to the best of your ability.
Yeah, and have confidence in your ability to do it as well.
Yeah, listen, confidence,
obviously
comes with time, because after a while you've done it. If you've done something a lot, then it's the famous, is it the 10,000 hours or 1,000 hours that you've done something and then you're good at it? There'll always be times when you'll be nervous, there's some interviews that I know will be tricky, even now, and I've done a lot. And I'm right to be nervous, because you're right to be on alert, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Veronica, for that question.
Thank you.
Veronica is also a mentee on the Trust, and I want to ask you, because you are a mentor and you've been a supporter of the Trust for a really long time, why have you decided to sort of align yourself with the Trust, and why do you think the work that they do is so important?
I think it started, when I was still at Al Jazeera, and I think the Trust wanted to broaden its pool of mentors, and an email went round. I think before I didn't feel that I had enough experience, and then I had a baby, and that means I had no time for anything. and then the email came around when the baby was no longer like a small baby. And I was just really, and I've had quite a few mentees, and some with accents, some not. One Welsh, which was amazing because she's second language English as well.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And it was very interesting working with her, because you'd be amazed how many of the issues were very similar. And it just made me laugh that there I was, like an Italian who learned English in Denmark, helping a Welsh woman try to broadcast in English. But, she's done very well in her career she did it. It's all, it's all her work, obviously, but I'm very proud and very happy. So I just think, again, I never had a mentor for this when I was going through my difficulties. And I think it's so important sometimes to just talk to someone. You need to stand back. And I think at the start of your career, first of all, you look around. And I remember when we finished, the city course, you're like, it's almost like a race. You're looking around like, oh, well, they've got this job and it's a big program, but that person is already presenting and that person is a reporter. And now it'd be things like that person has a podcast. Whereas I think sometimes you need to sit back and think, okay, but what is it that's right for me? And that's why I think the mentor scheme is so important, because you have someone that's kind of, been around the block a little bit and also understands how the industry is changing. I would not give the same advice now that I was giving even 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, frankly, because things are changing so much. And within a newsroom, we really feel it. So, I think I wish I'd had a mentor. I had people that helped me. That's not fair, but not quite. It was in the same scheme where you have that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've run out of time. But I did want to ask you if you have any last things that you want to say, just in general, to early career or aspiring or working journalists. Any last pieces of advice?
I would say that there's a lot of changes going on. I guess not everything that glitters is gold. there, and I get this because I've spent the past 15 years getting emails going, I want to be a TV presenter. Listen, it's great to be in front of a mic. It's great to be in front of camera. Well, it's great if you want to. Build on your journalism, right? And especially if you genuinely do want to be a presenter, best way to do it is to be a reporter or producer. I mean, I spent years as a reporter and especially as a producer. Invaluable experience when it comes to presenting. Make sure that the things you're doing eventually lead to money. And I don't mean a lot of money, but I do mean you need to look at a career. What are you building that is eventually going to allow you to, pay the rent, pay a mortgage, pay whatever. And I know it's tricky because, there's a lot of changes, especially with the big networks. And it's a tricky time. It's a difficult time, and journalists are being attacked, and not just in war zones, even though that's getting worse. It's just online. People will go for you because, especially with the algorithm world of social media, people are slightly used to their echo chambers. And if you're doing your job right, you will make people angry. So be prepared for that. This job is not about being popular or even being liked, especially these days. And it's interesting. I think it's one of the things that me going to Al Jazeera when I did taught me, because you're too young to remember. It was 2006. It was the height of the war on terror, and this channel launched by Arabs. It was so in English, and people genuinely thought we were terrorists. And I got ostracized. People stopped speaking to me. Some people, not everyone. I got spat at on the tube, not quite on me, but near my feet. And it taught me what it's like to be hated in those early years. I think now things are different. Al Jazeera was very revolutionary at the time. It was the decolonization of journalism before any of us talked in using that language. And it taught me that sometimes you can do something that you think is right, that is right, and still be hated. And that was a valuable lesson. So I'm not, maybe this is sounding too negative. You're not going to be hated. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. But these are tough times, and you have to be ready to be verbally attacked on social media. Anchor yourself in the truth. Anchor yourself in fact. Try not to self-censor out of fear, right?
Yeah.
The truth is your friend would be my final parting words.
No, yeah. I think that's amazing advice to end on. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the John Schofield Trust podcast. For more episodes, make sure to follow us. Or if you want to know more about the Trust, head to www.johnscofieldtrust.org.uk and follow us on Instagram @JohnSchofieldTrust. See you next time.